Well, as far as we're told. But once again, I come away from this story convinced that her life would have been very different after meeting Jesus. The woman had been caught in adultery, so the Pharisees said. Although the one person notable for his absence is the man involved. Where is he? They're happy to assert that this woman should be executed for her behaviour, because that's what we're talking about, an execution. So should the man involved, according to the law that they so enthusiastically cite. They just bring the woman. Well, I guess that was typical of this male-dominated Jewish society, and seems to spoil their argument somewhat right from the start, doesn't it? I'm sure it was something that would have immediately got Jesus' back up, if we can say that about Jesus. The woman, of course, was just being used as a tool with which to attack Jesus. She was a pawn in a bigger game the Pharisees were playing, and they just didn't have an ounce of compassion on her. As well, they bring her to him while he's speaking to a crowd of people, making a spectacle of this poor woman in front of them all. Jesus would have marked that one down against them as well, I'm sure. But of course, that was a necessary part of their plan, that the crowd would hear what was said, part of the trap they thought they had set for him. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? And verse 6 tells us they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing Jesus. So what was the trap? What was it they thought they might be able to accuse him of? Well, on the one hand, he might severely disappoint most of the crowd around him by upholding such a harsh law, and perhaps at the same time fall foul of the Roman authorities, who actually were the only ones who had the authority to authorise executions. On the other hand, they could criticise him if he spoke against the law or against Scripture. If he said she should not be stoned, if he forgave the woman. He might even been accused of blasphemy if he claimed the right to forgive sins, which Jesus did sometimes, we know, even though only God can do that. So there were several ways perhaps in which the Pharisees might be able to get their hooks into him. Back to pirates there, sorry, that was just a sudden image I had there. Depending on what Jesus said. Though I suspect they probably knew or were already able to guess what was most likely going to be the second of those possibilities by which they would trap Jesus, that he was never likely to agree with stoning this poor woman to death. But either way, yes, it was a tricky situation. The trap was set, seemingly, for Jesus. And for a while, he said nothing at all. He ignored them. Quite confident, I think, that they were never going to carry out this threat against the woman, whatever he said. It was no genuine court of law, just a contrived situation to try and trap Jesus. And people have often speculated, what was Jesus writing in the sand with his finger while he just ignored them? Well, I think the chances are it was nothing very relevant or important. Otherwise we'd be told, wouldn't we? But it is rather interesting, though, that while the law was being questioned, while the commandments from Scripture were being questioned, Jesus should be writing with his finger. You see, in Exodus, when the 10 Commandments were given to Moses by God, including the command not to commit adultery, we read this, Exodus 31. When the Lord had finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 stone tablets of the testimony, the 10 Commandments, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. Well, here was God the Son, the lawgiver himself, with authority to rewrite, to reinterpret his own law with the touch of his finger. when Jesus does eventually speak, he has an answer which just dumbfounds them and leaves them unable to criticise him. If any of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. They were left speechless. He called their bluff without having to openly take sides or commit himself to any comment, actually, on the law. And, of course, he'd in effect turned the finger on them. You're happy to talk about this woman's sin in front of everyone, but what about you? Are you so perfect? Well, what could they say? Only admit they weren't perfect, and they certainly didn't want to get into any discussion about their faults and failings, I'm sure. That wasn't the direction they wanted things to go. So they slowly drifted away, muttering to themselves, I'm sure, frustrated that Jesus had escaped their trap yet again. Well, Jesus shows great wisdom here in answering the Pharisees, reminiscent perhaps of Solomon, that great king from the Old Testament who had such a reputation for wisdom when posed with tricky questions, maybe like this. It was the kind of thing expected of an ideal king. And just as a king would have the right to pardon a criminal, so here Jesus pardons this woman. He does not condemn her. Here's a little story about Queen Victoria. Victoria was only 18 when she succeeded to the throne of England. Soon afterwards, the Lord Chamberlain presented her with several documents that required her signature. Among them was a paper concerning a man who had committed a serious crime. He'd been sentenced to death. The Queen's signature was required for his execution to be carried out, but the young Queen was hesitant. And must I become a party to his death? She asked. I fear it so, unless your Majesty desires to exercise her royal prerogative of mercy. To her delight, Victoria was informed she had the power to pardon the condemned man. She said, as an expression of the spirit in which I desire to rule, I will exercise my royal prerogative. She wrote the word pardoned on the document, and the prisoner was set free. As an expression of the spirit in which I desire to rule, she said. Well, this incident at the temple was surely an expression of the spirit in which Jesus desires to rule. The one for whom mercy, whenever possible, always triumphs over judgment. It's another example of the wonderful grace of God. I don't condemn you, Jesus said. You see, the only one there who was actually without sin, who did have every right to throw the first stone, well, he chose not to. And isn't this the message of the gospel on which our lives depend, by which we are saved? If we come to Jesus, sinful though we are, we will not be condemned, no matter what we have done. That surely is one important teaching point we glean from this incident. What else can we learn? Well, maybe to recognise that we, like the Pharisees, are so often to criticise and condemn others for what they do wrong, for the mistakes they make, and yet we're reluctant to examine ourselves very closely at all and admit those faults and failings. There's an old saying, isn't there, that when you point a finger at somebody else, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you. And I talked about that saying of Jesus earlier on. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? It's one good reason why when we come to communion, which we are going to at the close of our service, that it's good, as the Bible tells us, to examine ourselves, to ask God to point out where the sin is in our lives, because we don't always see it. Point it out so that we can then confess it back to him and ask for his forgiveness before we then recommit ourselves to him through taking bread and wine. It's a process we need to go through again and again. Another point coming out of this story is the way in which Jesus gives this woman a second chance. As a result, I think, of her attitude towards her sin. I know that from what we read, we can't tell anything directly about how she felt about her sin. But when I think about the very strong attitude Jesus always took against those who were either oblivious of their sin or chose to push it aside, the way he treated them, like the Pharisees, well, I can only believe that he recognized in this woman that she was fully aware of the wrong she was in. And I think that she was ashamed of it. And in those situations, Jesus always shows a gentle and understanding attitude. He always forgives when that forgiveness is truly sought. And so too here, he effectively forgives the woman by saying he's not going to condemn her. And we need to take that attitude of Jesus at face value for ourselves. So often we hang on to the guilt and shame of wrongs we've done in the past, and we sort of hang on to it. God doesn't want that. He doesn't want that. He wants to do all he can to lift us out of that, to help us to get back on track, to make a new start, to put those sins in the past that we've confessed and he has forgiven. He knows how weak we are. He knows how prone to sin we are, and he loves us all the same. Jesus will not condemn those who are truly sorry for their wrongdoing. But at the same time, let's not forget the words at the end of the conversation when he says to the woman, "Go now and leave your life of sin." Jesus does not show a tolerance towards sin here. It's not saying that sin is okay. That's not what forgiveness is about. Sin isn't okay. Sin breaks God's heart. Sin is what put Jesus on the cross. And ultimately, it must come under God's judgment. The wonderful thing is, sin can be condemned without needing to condemn the sinner. If there is that repentant attitude, if we come openly and honestly to God and ask him to deal with those sins and take them away. And he will do that every time. Every time he will then say, "Now go and leave your life of sin." Try again. And we cannot take that command lightly. We must not cultivate within ourselves a tolerance for the things we know we do wrong. Or inevitably we will come to the point where our requests for forgiveness are not genuine, where the sorrow is not genuine. And that asking for forgiveness becomes just an empty ritual, words said without the heart agreeing. No, we must set our hearts on ridding our lives of sin for Jesus' sake and be conscientious about that, but knowing we have a Father who is always ready to forgive. Forgive us when we fall and help us back on our feet, to set us back on the right road again. And the final point, well, that's to take the example of Jesus seriously and try to follow him in our attitude towards one another, within the church and beyond. Jesus gives us a wonderful example here of how to react towards others who fall to temptation and sin, in whatever way that might be. Yes, we need to uphold the truth and a godly way of living with integrity, with a passion, and yet at the same time be ever so patient and understanding with those who fail, who sin, just as Jesus did with this woman. Here's another little story for you, which I have used before, I think, but I like it. Stephen first learned about forgiveness from Miss Roberts, his first grade teacher. He's American. Each day after lunch, she allowed her class to purchase an orange sickle, a frozen orange juice on a stick, for dessert. It was the highlight of Stephen's school day. One day, he forgot his money. It just so happened, however, that Miss Roberts had found a dime on the classroom floor that day and offered to return it to its owner. As he raced forward to claim the money, he was challenged by a red-haired girl who insisted it was hers. Two people claiming the same dime. A problem for most people, but not for Miss Roberts. She settled the dispute quickly, suggesting that each of them bring a note from their mother stating that they had been sent to school that day with a dime. Clever. Miss Roberts must have seen the horror on Stephen's face as he realised that everyone would soon discover he was both a thief and a liar. He was already dreading the spanking, it's a bit old, in those days, his mother would give him for his dishonesty. Just as the consequences of his crime were about to overwhelm him, Miss Roberts came and knelt beside his desk. "Stevie, I've found another dime," she said. She looked him right in the eye and handed the dime to him. "Here, it must be yours." Immediately Stephen broke down in tears and confessed what Miss Roberts already knew. "Well, that's okay," she said, patting him on his head. "We all make mistakes." And after apologising to the red-haired girl, he enjoyed the best-tasting orange-sickle he'd ever eaten. Well, the boy's sin was not overlooked, and there's no doubt he learnt an important lesson for the future. But his sin was dealt with compassion, without any unnecessary unpleasantness, by involving as few people as possible, and in a way which left him in a good place to go forward and do better next time, even with an incentive to do so. So often we err on the side of condemnation and leave people feeling a complete failure, feeling miserable with themselves, uncared for, with no way out, no way forward to a better place, just that ongoing awkward feeling about what others are thinking of them. The sinner needs to know that they're still cared for, that they will be genuinely forgiven and accepted again afterwards. Otherwise, they're going to feel rejected. And yes, for that to happen, it needs words to be spoken, doesn't it? However hard that is to do, things don't get resolved by just shoving them under the carpet, as it were, and ignoring it. Jesus made it very clear to the woman that her relationship was restored with him. "I do not condemn you." And so we need to find some equivalent words, don't we, to say to those who've done wrong to us maybe, and are trying to recover from that and restore the relationship. We can find the right words, I think, without compromising our view of the sin itself, because love finds a way, doesn't it? We have that love for one another. It's hard to get the balance right, but so important that we try to do so, with God's help and with the example of Jesus to guide us. It is one way in which we show love to one another, love to others, and it's a wonderful witness when we demonstrate God's forgiveness in that way, by the way we are prepared to forgive others.